It began with silence. The kind that settles before a storm, the kind that makes the air taste metallic. At 6:42 a.m., two black Range Rovers rolled through the wrought iron gates of Royal Lodge, their tinted windows reflecting the gray English dawn. No press, no cheering crowd, no royal guards standing at attention. Just the echo of tires on gravel and the realization that, for Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, time had finally run out. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The once proud Duke of York, brother to the King of England, was about to lose everything: his title, his home, and possibly his freedom. And the man ordering it all? His own brother, King Charles III. You have to ask yourself, what could drive a monarch, already burdened by public scrutiny, to exile his own flesh and blood? Was this justice long overdue, or a desperate attempt to save the monarchy from its own decay? Because behind the palace walls, there are whispers of money quietly disappearing, of hidden bank accounts, of investigations buried until they weren't. And in the middle of it all, two names that once graced royal invitations now headline scandal columns: Andrew and Fergie. They were supposed to be yesterday's news. The fallen Duke and his fiery ex-wife, living quietly in Windsor, feeding the ducks, smiling for cameras when necessary. But something happened. Something so big, so politically dangerous, that King Charles could no longer pretend blood was thicker than the crown. And the British public? They're divided. Some say it's justice at last, accountability, royal style. Others whisper this is revenge, payback for decades of embarrassment. Either way, one thing's clear: the walls of Royal Lodge are closing in. But before we get to that final eviction notice, before the King's personal secretary hand-delivered those papers that effectively ended Andrew's royal existence, let's rewind. Let's go back to the beginning, the day King Charles lost his patience. Because you see, this wasn't sudden. This was years in the making. A slow burn of scandal, shame, and stubborn pride. And the first spark? The one that ignited the royal wildfire? It came not from Buckingham Palace, but from an office in Westminster, when a confidential file labeled "Misconduct in Public Office, York" landed on a police investigator's desk. London police had reopened their inquiry. Yes, you heard that right. After years of deflection, denials, and carefully worded royal statements, the case was back in motion. Witnesses were being re-interviewed. Evidence was being revisited. And while the official line was routine review, insiders said something else, something darker. There were new statements, new leads, new political pressure. Because when Parliament starts asking questions about a royal's finances, even the king listens. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson. Andrew still clung to his privileges, demanding staff, security, and status. Sarah still maneuvered through society events, acting as if the royal invitation list had her name permanently engraved on it. They didn't see the warning signs. The dinners canceled. The budget quietly cut. The royal protection team reassigned elsewhere. Until one morning, a courier in a black suit arrived at their estate, carrying a document sealed with the royal crest. It wasn't an invitation. It was a declaration. Royal Lodge, their beloved estate in Windsor Great Park, was to be vacated within weeks. No negotiation. No appeal. The king had spoken. You might be wondering, why now? Why, after years of looking the other way, did Charles decide enough was enough? The answer, as it turns out, lies in a combination of timing, politics, and cold, royal survival instinct. The monarchy has been under siege. Polls show declining support, especially among younger Britons who see the royals as relics of privilege. The scandals surrounding Andrew didn't just embarrass the crown, they endangered it. And after Queen Elizabeth's death, there was no longer a shield to hide behind. The moral anchor of the monarchy was gone. Charles had to act. And here's where it gets truly chilling. Insiders claim that Charles didn't just act out of duty. He acted out of fear. Fear that if he didn't remove his brother from the public eye, the monarchy itself could face scrutiny unlike anything since the abdication crisis of 1936. The government was restless. The tabloids were sharpening their knives. The public was losing patience. There's an old saying among palace staff: the crown protects those who protect the crown. Andrew had done the opposite. And so, the order came down. Royal Lodge was to be repossessed by the Crown Estate. Andrew and Sarah were to relocate, quietly, discreetly, permanently, abroad. In other words, exile. Now, exile isn't a word the royals use lightly. It hasn't been uttered since the days of Edward VIII, who left Britain for love. But this exile wasn't romantic. It was punitive, cold, calculated. And for Andrew, it was devastating. Imagine living in the same home for decades, a sprawling estate filled with memories, photographs, and ghosts of royal privilege, and being told it's no longer yours. Imagine opening your mailbox to find a letter with your brother's royal seal, ordering your removal. For all his arrogance, even Andrew reportedly sat in silence for minutes after reading it. Sarah wept. The staff, loyal but weary, began quietly packing boxes. But this wasn't just about property. It was about erasure. King Charles wasn't just stripping Andrew of comfort. He was stripping him of identity. Once a duke, now a disgraced man in exile. As journalists began circling, palace insiders tried to contain the narrative. This is about fiscal responsibility, one claimed. The Crown Estate needs to reallocate resources. But the truth was far uglier. This was a calculated act of royal self-preservation. The monarchy was cleaning house, and Andrew was the first casualty. Still, one question lingers like a ghost in those Windsor halls. Did Charles do it to save the monarchy or himself? Because if the allegations against Andrew lead to criminal charges, and multiple sources inside the Met Police suggest they will, it won't just be the Duke who stands trial in the court of public opinion. It will be the entire royal institution. And what about Sarah Ferguson? For decades, she has reinvented herself, transforming scandal into survival. From her divorce to her financial missteps, from her infamous tabloid photos to her brief redemption as a royal confidant, she's always managed to find her footing. But this time feels different. The charity allegations cut deep, hitting the one area she couldn't spin with charm or self-deprecating humor: money meant for the vulnerable. Investigators are reportedly tracing transactions that span multiple countries. The whispers say she'll soon face formal questioning. And if evidence surfaces that ties her to financial misconduct, her exile won't just be royal, it'll be legal. So here we are, a royal family at war with itself, a king fighting to preserve his throne, and two fallen figures running out of allies, out of excuses, and out of time. But here's the thing. Exile isn't the end of the story. Not for Andrew, not for Sarah, and certainly not for Charles. Because as history shows, royal scandals have a strange way of resurfacing. The deeper you bury them, the louder they echo when they rise again. And this one, it's about to get louder, much louder. Because what if I told you that inside Buckingham Palace, locked away in a private vault, there exists a document, one that could explain why Charles moved so decisively, why he chose exile over silence, and why the monarchy's darkest secrets might finally see daylight. A document so explosive, it could turn this royal exile into a full-blown constitutional crisis. We'll get to that. But first, we have to revisit the moment it all began, the night the crown lost its patience. The night King Charles realized that being a brother was a luxury he could no longer afford. And what he did next would not only exile Andrew and Sarah Ferguson from Britain, it would redefine the very meaning of royal blood. Because once the crown decides you're a liability, there's no coming back. And as the morning sun rose over Windsor, two words echoed through the palace corridors, words that would mark the end of an era. Send notice. The night was unnervingly quiet inside Buckingham Palace. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you, it watches you. Even the guard stationed by the East Wing said the air felt heavier than usual, like something monumental was about to happen. And in a way it was. Because that night, the king decided to break the unspoken rule that had protected the monarchy for generations. Never punish your own in public. It started around 9:15 p.m. King Charles was alone in his private study, the only light coming from the desk lamp reflecting off his spectacles. On the table sat 3 files, each stamped with red wax, each bearing a single name in gold: Andrew, Ferguson, and York. He had read them all, twice. Every page, every report, every line of inquiry. The allegations weren't new. He'd heard whispers before, but this time, the evidence was real. It was official. It was damning. The first file detailed Andrew's alleged involvement in public misconduct. Payments, connections, phone logs. The police had reopened their inquiry, and this time, they weren't just following leads. They were closing in. The second file? Sarah Ferguson's charity finances. Wire transfers routed through obscure foundations. Missing sums in the tens of thousands. Her smiling face at charity galas now looked like irony on paper. And the third file, the thickest of them all, carried no title, just a royal seal. It wasn't about Andrew or Sarah. It was about the monarchy itself. The potential damage if these scandals went public. The king leaned back, rubbing his temples. He had faced public humiliation before. The fallout from his marriage to Diana. The relentless scrutiny of his private life. Even doubts about his fitness to rule. But this was different. This was internal rot. He glanced at the clock. 10 minutes until the private council meeting. The one he had called behind closed doors, with only 3 people invited. Queen Camilla, Prince William, and Sir Clive Alderton, his private secretary. When they entered, the tension in the room was thick enough to slice with a sword. Charles didn't waste words. "It's time," he said simply. No more protecting him. Camilla looked at him carefully, reading his face the way only she could. "Are you sure this is what you want, darling? Exile? It's extreme." William, standing by the fireplace, didn't hesitate. "It's necessary. Every time his name surfaces, we all pay for it. The monarchy can't survive another wave of disgrace." A silence followed, long, heavy, loaded with history. Because this wasn't just about a scandal. It was about a bloodline. A family that had spent centuries mastering the art of survival through silence. Charles finally said it out loud. Then he must leave the country. Camilla drew a sharp breath. "And Sarah?" He looked down at the papers. "Both." You could feel the chill spread across the room. Sir Clive quietly took notes, knowing this night would be written into royal history. The night a king exiled his own brother. "Do it discreetly," Charles said. "We cannot have another circus." That phrase, "another circus," hung in the air like smoke. It was his coded way of saying, no more public embarrassment, no more scandals splashed across tabloids, no more tears on television. But as the meeting ended, William lingered. "He's not going to go quietly, you know," he warned. Charles didn't look up. "Then he'll be escorted." And that was that. The decision was made. But while the palace moved with cold efficiency across town, Andrew was enjoying his usual evening ritual, a late dinner, a glass of claret, and an illusion of relevance. Royal Lodge had become his fortress, his last remaining symbol of status. Staff still addressed him as Your Royal Highness, even though officially, that title had been stripped. He liked to hear it, even if it was only out of habit or pity. Then came the knock. 3 short raps on the door, followed by silence. When he opened it, he saw a courier dressed in black, holding a sealed envelope. No words were exchanged. The man simply handed it over and left. Inside, on royal stationery, was the message that ended everything. By order of His Majesty the King, the property known as Royal Lodge shall be vacated forthwith. You are instructed to comply with the relocation process under the supervision of the Crown Estate. Failure to comply will result in formal proceedings. Andrew's hand trembled slightly as he read it. Not because he didn't expect consequences, but because he never thought his own brother would sign them. In the drawing room, Sarah Ferguson looked up from her phone, sensing something was wrong. Inside, Andrew sat in silence. The weight of his own arrogance finally caught up to him. Sarah moved through the rooms, whispering to the portraits on the walls. Portraits of a life she'd never truly belonged to, and yet couldn't live without. What broke her, though, wasn't the exile. It was what she discovered next. Because tucked in the same envelope as the eviction order was a second document, an official notice regarding Sarah's trust. It stated that the charity's accounts were under review by the Charity Commission, with cooperation from the Serious Fraud Office. They were both under investigation now. The letter ended with a chilling line. You are advised to remain available for questioning. She stared at those words until they blurred. For all her charm and optimism, Sarah knew what that meant. The palace wasn't just washing its hands of them. It was preparing to let the law finish what the crown started. By noon, the story had leaked. King Charles exiles disgraced Duke. The headlines screamed. Twitter exploded. News anchors interrupted broadcasts. Overnight, Andrew and Fergie became symbols of royal downfall. And here's where it gets fascinating. According to palace insiders, the king didn't flinch. Not once. He instructed his team to release a calm, dignified statement about necessary measures for the stability of the crown. No denial, no defense, just quiet confirmation. Because Charles knew something the world didn't, something hidden in those palace files. For months, the Metropolitan Police had been quietly piecing together a timeline that didn't make sense, a timeline filled with unexplained meetings, missing travel records, and payments that moved faster than any royal motorcade. They called it a routine re-examination. Insiders called it a reckoning. And it began with a single anonymous email. No one knows exactly who sent it. Some say it came from a former aide who couldn't bear the silence anymore. Others say it came from abroad, someone who'd been paid off years ago and was now looking for redemption. What mattered was that it contained attachments, PDFs, bank slips, and 2 photographs that sent shivers through the yard. Within 24 hours, an internal memo was circulated among the investigative team, reopened the York file. Andrew's name was back on the board. At first, he didn't believe it. He thought the papers were bluffing when whispers of a renewed inquiry hit the tabloids. He'd been through this before. Scandals come, headlines burn bright, and then the press finds a new toy. But this time, the calls weren't from journalists. They were from the police. A detective from the Specialist Crime Command requested an interview to clarify certain matters. That was the phrase, clarify certain matters. When the palace got wind of it, panic rippled through the ranks. Clarify meant something far worse. They'd found something that couldn't be ignored. Inside Scotland Yard, senior officers reviewed years of reports long thought buried. A pattern emerged. Between 2015 and 2020, several charitable and public funds had been linked to representational expenses authorized by the office of the Duke of York. The problem? Many of those expenses had no corresponding records of public duties. In plain English, the money went somewhere, but not where it was supposed to. And then came the kicker. One of the accounts used to process those funds was connected, indirectly, to a financial trust registered in the Cayman Islands. A trust whose listed contact was a consultant known only by initials, SF. Sarah Ferguson. The investigators didn't know yet how deep it went, but it was enough to put both names, Andrew and Fergie, on the same page of a criminal brief for the first time in history. Meanwhile, Andrew was calling in favors. Her statement landed directly on the desk of the investigating officer at Scotland Yard. Within 72 hours, an evidence request was issued to several UK banks. The circle was closing. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson tried to spin the narrative. She gave interviews hinting that the renewed investigations were politically motivated, a witch hunt designed to distract from larger issues. She smiled, as she always did, but behind the scenes, she was terrified. She knew how delicate their finances had become. What the public didn't know was that both Andrew and Sarah had been quietly negotiating refinancing terms for Royal Lodge, using their expected royal allowances as leverage. With exile looming, those deals evaporated overnight. Their financial safety net was gone. But Andrew still believed he could ride the wave. He'd been trained from childhood to survive scandal by standing firm. Deny, deflect, outlast. It worked before, why not now? Because this time, the king wasn't protecting him. When word reached Buckingham Palace that Scotland Yard was preparing a potential charge of misconduct in public office, Charles called his private secretary. Let them proceed, he said simply. Do not interfere. Those 4 words sealed Andrew's fate. Even the Queen, in her day, had occasionally intervened behind the scenes to temper investigations or advise restraint. But Charles? He was a reformer. He'd made a vow to modernize the monarchy. I'll show them. The consultant warned him that the palace had already distanced itself. If you go public, they'll destroy you, he said. But Andrew was past reason. I've been destroyed already, he replied. And that's when he made the call, to a journalist known for exposing royal secrets. You can almost hear the desperation in that decision. Imagine the fear of a man who once dined with presidents, now sneaking into hotel lobbies to arrange off-the-record meetings. The journalist agreed to hear him out. What Andrew didn't realize was that their conversation was being recorded by the very outlet that had been chasing him for months. The next morning, excerpts appeared online. Not the full interview, just enough to make him look defiant, bitter, and cornered. His Majesty is mistaken if he thinks he can simply erase history, Andrew was quoted as saying. The palace exploded. In a single stroke, Andrew had turned a private investigation into a public spectacle. Overnight, the term royal exile began trending. Public outrage hit new highs. Polls showed 74% of Britons believed Andrew should be stripped of all privileges and removed from royal residences immediately. And that was the moment the king stopped trying to save him. Within hours, royal aides began coordinating with Crown Estate lawyers to expedite the eviction order. Security permissions were revoked. Travel privileges suspended. Royal staff were instructed to transfer archives and sensitive communications to locked storage. It wasn't just exile, it was erasure in motion. But here's the twist. While the world watched the spectacle unfold, Scotland Yard wasn't done. They were sitting on something far more dangerous than leaked interviews or gossip. Something that could destroy not only Andrew's reputation, but the Crown's moral credibility. A document. One that traced back to a financial transfer between a royal-linked foundation and a private account under Andrew's name. The amount wasn't massive, but the date was. It coincided with a period when Andrew was officially representing the monarchy overseas. In other words, a royal duty linked to personal profit. And if that allegation proved true, it wouldn't just be bad optics. It would be a criminal offense. Detectives knew they were dealing with history. Charging a member of the royal family is unprecedented, one investigator reportedly said. But if the evidence holds, we won't have a choice. By early autumn, the royal lawyers were in crisis mode. Every phone call between the palace and Downing Street was tense. There were rumors, never confirmed, that MI5 had quietly briefed the king on potential fallout if charges were made public. Containment is impossible, they warned. Prepare for the storm. And yet, Charles said only one thing. Let justice run its course. For Andrew, it was betrayal. For Charles, it was necessity. For Britain, it was history in the making. By now, even Sarah Ferguson had gone quiet. She stopped giving interviews. She stopped smiling for cameras. Friends said she spent her days pacing the halls, muttering about unfair treatment and palace betrayal. But deep down, she knew the tide couldn't be stopped. And when Scotland Yard formally informed the palace that Andrew might soon face public charges, the king gave his final instruction. Prepare the public for the inevitable. The statement drafted that night would go down as one of the most consequential in modern royal history, a masterpiece of calm language concealing chaos. But the king wasn't the only one drafting statements. Because while he moved to distance himself from his brother, Sarah Ferguson was about to make her own move. One that would drag her back into the spotlight and ignite an entirely new chapter of royal scandal. And what she said on live television would turn quiet disgrace into global outrage. It's often said that Sarah Ferguson could charm her way out of any scandal. But this time, charm wasn't enough. This time, the walls were closing in, and the smiling Duchess who once danced through disaster found herself facing something she couldn't spin, smile, or sell away. Because when money meant for charity starts vanishing, the story stops being royal gossip. It becomes a criminal investigation. And for Sarah, the woman who built an entire brand on reinvention, this scandal was the one storm she couldn't outtalk. It began quietly, almost invisibly, like most royal disasters do. A routine audit of Sarah's Trust, her signature charity organization, designed to empower women and children. It was meant to be a formality, a yearly tick-box exercise required by the Charity Commission. But when auditors noticed irregularities, small inconsistencies at first, it triggered a deeper dive. And what they found raised more questions than answers. Transactions that didn't match donor reports. Payments made to consultants who didn't exist. Travel expenses listed for official charity work that coincided suspiciously with luxury trips abroad. And the most damning discovery, donations from international sponsors that were never logged in the UK records. Now, this wasn't new territory for Sarah. Scandal followed her like perfume. From her infamous toe-sucking tabloid fiasco in the 90s to her televised confession about selling access to Prince Andrew for cash, she'd always been a headline magnet. But she had survived all that because the world had seen her as foolish, not dangerous. Naive, not deceitful. But financial misconduct? That was different. This was the kind of scandal that could put her behind bars. When investigators first reached out to the palace, they phrased it delicately. We'd like to clarify some details about the Duchess's charity accounts. But behind the politeness was fire. They suspected the charity was being used as a shell, an elegant front for personal transactions disguised as philanthropy. It was a slow unraveling. At first, Sarah cooperated. She sent documents, invoices, even cheerful notes insisting she had nothing to hide. But the deeper investigators dug, the worse it got. One particular entry raised red flags: a £75,000 consulting fee paid to a company registered in Dubai. The services rendered? Strategic donor relations. The company's listed director? A former aide of Sarah's, now living comfortably abroad. When questioned, Sarah called it a miscommunication. But the audit team wasn't buying it. More inconsistencies emerged, small amounts here and there that added up to hundreds of thousands. Each labeled as outreach, ambassador travel, or sponsorship engagement. Each lacking corresponding documentation. Then came the worst revelation. A whistleblower from inside the charity came forward, an administrator who had managed donor correspondence. She claimed she was instructed to alter donor records before audits. "We were told to make it look right," she said. "To make it look royal." Those words alone were enough to escalate the investigation from an audit to a formal inquiry. And at the center of it all stood Sarah Ferguson, smiling awkwardly at charity galas while the ground beneath her crumbled. When news broke that the Charity Commission had partnered with the Serious Fraud Office, panic hit the palace. The monarchy had just begun recovering from Andrew's disasters. Another scandal could reignite public fury. King Charles's advisors held emergency discussions. Should they release a statement distancing the royal household from Sarah? Should they emphasize that she was no longer officially part of the firm? But Sarah wasn't waiting for their help. She went on the offensive. She appeared on a talk show, sitting under the warm studio lights, eyes bright, tone rehearsed. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said with a nervous laugh. "I've always been transparent about my work. Every penny I've raised has gone to helping people." The audience clapped politely, but the journalists didn't. Because within hours, leaked documents appeared online showing otherwise. Emails, receipts, and bank details connecting the charity to luxury purchases and five-star hotel stays. The headlines wrote themselves. Duchess of Debt strikes again. Charity Queen or Charity Con? Fergie's finances under fire. The same woman who once reinvented herself as a motivational speaker, children's author, and self-proclaimed survivor of adversity was now facing allegations of fraud. But the real shock wasn't that Sarah had mismanaged money. It was that some of that money might have been funneled into accounts linked to Andrew's private expenses. Yes, the exile was now tied together by money. Investigators traced several payments labeled as royal engagements that coincided with Andrew's travel dates. Flights, accommodation, entertainment, all listed under Sarah's trust. The implication was clear. Charity funds were allegedly being used to bankroll royal luxuries. When Sarah heard about this, she reportedly snapped. "How dare they drag Andrew into this again?" she shouted, according to a former aide. "This was my work, my responsibility." But in the public eye, her defiance looked like guilt. To make matters worse, a former donor went public, revealing that he'd been promised a private meeting with a royal representative in exchange for his contribution, a meeting that never happened. "It felt like a transaction," he told reporters, "not charity." That quote went viral. Overnight, Sarah's name was trending globally again, and not for the reasons she'd hoped. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace was done playing diplomat. They released a carefully worded statement. The activities and financial affairs of Sarah, Duchess of York, are her own and are not connected to the royal household. Translation: "You're on your own." That line broke her. Friends later said she cried for hours after reading it. For decades, she'd stayed close enough to the royal circle to maintain relevance, even after her divorce. She lived on royal property, attended certain events, and was tolerated for the sake of appearances. But now, that lifeline was gone. The king had turned his back. And then came the raid. Investigators, armed with court authorization, visited the charity's London office. Computers were seized. Files taken. One source described it as surgical. No arrests were made, but everyone knew what that meant. The evidence was speaking for itself. Meanwhile, tabloids devoured the story. Some painted Sarah as a careless woman undone by vanity. Others went further, calling her a royal con artist in designer heels. She tried one last time to win sympathy. Another interview. Another defense. This time, she looked less composed. They want to destroy me, she said tearfully. I've always tried to do good in the world. But public sentiment had hardened. People weren't buying redemption arcs anymore. Not from her. Not after so many chances. Even her daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, reportedly pleaded with her to stop talking to the press. "Mum, please, you're making it worse," one of them said. But Sarah couldn't stay silent. It wasn't in her nature. She saw silence as surrender, and surrender wasn't her style. So she kept talking. And every time she did, investigators listened. Because every word she said gave them something new, a lead, a clue, a contradiction. Behind the scenes, forensic accountants were tracing every penny. They found patterns, luxury invoices disguised as charitable outreach, transportation bills matching Andrew's private movements, and invoices submitted by companies tied to Sarah's friends abroad. Authorized under palace oversight. That phrase changed everything. If it was true, it meant that someone within the royal administrative network had approved or at least acknowledged the transactions now under investigation, which meant the rot went higher than anyone thought. And Sarah? She now held the one thing that could make the monarchy tremble, a paper trail. So while the public saw a disgraced duchess on the brink of ruin, behind the scenes, Sarah Ferguson had leverage. Dangerous leverage. And the king, who had just exiled his brother and his brother's ex-wife, was about to realize he'd underestimated both. The palace has always had rules. Rules older than the marble beneath its floors and the crown jewels locked in its vaults. Rules that say a monarch must never show emotion, never act in anger, and never, ever, turn on his own. The palace has always had rules. Rules older than the marble beneath its floors and the crown jewels locked in its vaults. Rules that say a monarch must never show emotion, never act in anger, and never, ever, turn on his own. But on that night, those rules shattered. Because that was the night King Charles broke. It wasn't one headline or one investigation that pushed him over the edge. It was the accumulation of years. Decades of humiliation, scandal, and the exhausting weight of family secrets. And as more revelations about Andrew and Sarah poured in, something inside him finally snapped. It began with a simple briefing. The kind of meeting every monarch endures. Tidy folders, polite phrasing, bad news wrapped in diplomacy. But when the king's private secretary laid down the latest updates from Scotland Yard and the Charity Commission, Charles didn't even open the folders. He already knew what was inside. "Your Majesty," the aide said carefully, "there's more." Charles lifted his gaze, the faintest tremor in his jaw. "More. The Duchess's charity investigation has been expanded to include palace administrative correspondence." For a few seconds, the king said nothing. The silence was deafening. Then, in a voice colder than winter rain, he asked, "Are you telling me this family's incompetence now threatens the institution itself?" The aide hesitated. "Yes, sir." That was the moment. The exact second the monarch ceased being patient, diplomatic Charles. Every decision was measured. Every public word weighed like gold. But family was his weakness. Andrew had always been the reckless one. The charmer, the risk-taker, the one who never quite learned that royal titles don't grant immunity. And Sarah, with her endless optimism and opportunism, had only fueled the chaos. Together, they were a royal hurricane that never quite stopped spinning. For years, Charles tried to manage it quietly. He'd arranged settlements, mediated disputes, smoothed things over with government officials. But this time was different. This time, their actions weren't just embarrassing, they were endangering the monarchy's credibility. And in Charles's eyes, credibility was sacred. Every pound they touch, every word they speak, reflects on the crown. He said during that fateful meeting, "And if I allow this to continue, the people will think corruption is our birthright." The archbishop nodded gravely. "Then what do you intend to do, Your Majesty?" The king's answer came without hesitation. "I intend to make an example of them." That phrase landed like thunder. Camilla's eyes widened slightly. "You mean exile?" "I mean accountability," he replied. "Real accountability. The kind no one expects from us anymore." For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. And the king made his final decree. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson will be removed from royal property. Effective immediately. The Crown Estate will repossess Royal Lodge, and both will be advised to leave the country before the investigations conclude. William exhaled, a long, quiet breath of relief and disbelief. "You're finally doing it." Charles looked at him. "I should have done it years ago." Outside the palace, London was still awake. The tabloids were buzzing with rumors, the public growing restless. People wanted accountability. Politicians were whispering about reform. The monarchy couldn't afford to look like a sanctuary for scandal anymore. By midnight, the king's orders had already been translated into formal directives. Lawyers were preparing notices. Security heads were reviewing protection protocols. But what struck the palace staff the most that night wasn't the king's anger. It was his silence. He didn't rant. He didn't yell. He just moved with cold precision, as if centuries of royal instinct had taken over. The staff whispered about the storm behind the calm. One aide described it perfectly. It was like watching history reclaim its dignity through him. Still, Charles wasn't made of stone. Later that night, after the meeting dispersed, he retreated to his private sitting room. Alone, he poured a glass of scotch and sat staring at the portrait of his late mother. The candlelight flickered across her familiar face. He whispered to the empty room, "You were stronger than me, Mama. You would have handled this with grace. But I can't protect them anymore." It was the only time he allowed himself to sound human that night. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and called his secretary back in. "Make sure the letter is signed and sealed before dawn," he said. "And Clive, don't use the royal courier. Deliver it yourself." "Yes, Your Majesty." The order was carried out to the letter. By morning, the notice was on its way to Royal Lodge. Andrew's life as he knew it was about to collapse. But the king's breaking point didn't end with his brother's exile. It deepened. Because when the Charity Commission's latest findings reached the palace 2 days later, Charles realized this wasn't just about Andrew and Sarah. It was about everything he'd inherited. The entire legacy of royal silence and denial. The report suggested that certain palace correspondences could indicate awareness of Sarah's financial irregularities. That one line, in bureaucratic language, was dynamite. If proven true, it meant the monarchy wasn't just a victim of scandal, it was part of it. Charles slammed the report shut. "Not under my reign," he said through gritted teeth. From that moment, he became relentless. He ordered a private audit of all royal charities. Every trust, every fund, every project associated with the monarchy was scrutinized. It was the first time in British history a reigning monarch had demanded internal investigation into his own household. He knew what it meant: headlines, criticism, maybe even resentment from within the family. But he didn't care. The breaking point had freed him from hesitation. He called in William. "If we are to survive, we must be different. We must be honest." William nodded. "And if they turn on you?" "Then they turn," Charles said quietly. "I will not lead a dynasty of deceit." There was something almost tragic about it. The man who had spent his entire life waiting to wear the crown now realized that to protect it, he had to destroy part of his family. And yet, he did it. He didn't flinch when the eviction notices were executed. He didn't hesitate when Sarah's legal team protested. He didn't pause when Parliament requested clarification on royal funding. Every move was deliberate, every word measured. Even as the British press hailed him as the monarch who dared, Charles felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Because power without peace is just another kind of prison. One night, as he prepared for a state dinner, Camilla found him staring at his reflection in the mirror. "You did what had to be done," she said softly. He turned to her, eyes weary. "Did I? Or have I just torn my family apart to save a symbol?" Camilla didn't answer. She didn't need to. Both knew the truth. The monarchy was built on sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice was a familiar face. But what Charles didn't know was that his act of discipline, the purge that was supposed to end the scandals, had only begun a new chapter. Because while he was cleaning house at Buckingham Palace, someone else was preparing to make the ultimate betrayal. Someone with access, with documents, with motive. And when that betrayal surfaced, it wouldn't just challenge the king's authority. It would threaten the very foundation of the monarchy itself. Because secrets, once exiled, have a way of finding their way home. And the one secret buried deep inside Buckingham Palace's private archives, the one tied to Andrew, Sarah, and an unexpected royal connection, was about to explode. Royal Lodge had always been a symbol of privilege, a place where scandal went to rest and time politely forgot. Its lush gardens, centuries-old oak trees, and wide gravel paths once echoed with the laughter of royal children. It was meant to be a sanctuary, but in the aftermath of King Charles's decree, it became something else entirely. A gilded prison, and inside it, the fallen Duke of York wandered its echoing halls like a ghost haunting his own past. Andrew had known exile was coming, but not like this. Not with the cold efficiency of a royal command executed with military precision. The gates were closed. Security was reassigned. Staff were cut in half. The Crown Estate had begun the slow but deliberate process of repossessing the property, starting with inventory logs and sealed storage rooms. Every hallway he walked through carried reminders of his downfall. Portraits of him in military uniform. Framed photographs of his daughter's weddings. Even a painting of himself with his mother, Queen Elizabeth, now felt like a cruel memory. The man who once stood proudly beside her was now being erased by her son. He rarely left his study anymore. Curtains drawn, phone unplugged, television muted. The news channels had turned his life into a daily spectacle. Disgraced Duke faces eviction, one headline read. Royal scandal expands to include charity fraud, said another. Each word was another nail in the coffin of his public identity. Sarah tried to lift the mood at first. She'd make tea, sit beside him, and talk about their daughters or old friends who still sent messages of support. But Andrew barely listened. His once commanding tone had turned bitter, sharp-edged. Support? They're just watching the wreck, he'd mutter. They all are. Then came the inspectors. It was a Tuesday morning when 3 officials from the Crown Estate arrived in dark suits, accompanied by 2 discreet security officers. They didn't knock. They announced, "We're here to begin the formal review of property assets, Your Grace," one said, his voice flat. The title, Your Grace, hung in the air like sarcasm. Even they knew it didn't apply anymore. Andrew watched in silence as they moved from room to room, taking inventory of furniture, antiques, and artwork. They labeled items with tags, photographed documents, and made polite notes about state-owned fixtures. It was clinical, detached. Andrew hated them all. He called them vultures. But the truth was, the vultures were there because the carcass was real. The pressure inside the lodge grew unbearable. Heated arguments became routine. Andrew accused Sarah of bringing more shame with her interviews. Sarah accused him of destroying her by association. "You think this is just about you?" she shouted one evening. "They're coming for both of us." He slammed his hand on the table. "I fought for this country. I served it. And this is how they repay me." Sarah's response was simple. "You fought for yourself, Andrew. And now you're paying for it." The silence that followed was the sound of truth hitting bone. By the end of the week, Royal Lodge felt like an abandoned fortress. The grand rooms were stripped of tapestries and heirlooms. Storage boxes lined the hallways. Even the family portraits were removed, each one catalogued, bubble-wrapped, and taken away by the Crown Estate's handlers. One of the removal men, unaware of who he was addressing, made a quiet remark to another. "Imagine being kicked out of your own palace." Andrew heard it. He didn't respond. But that night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring at the gates through the darkness, remembering the nights his mother visited, the sound of laughter echoing across the garden. Those days were gone. The next morning, he received a letter. It bore the royal seal. The handwriting was unmistakable, King Charles's own. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. "Andrew, I have given this matter more thought than you may believe. The decisions made are not of anger, but of necessity. The monarchy cannot protect you any longer. I trust you will do the right thing, for the sake of our family, and for the institution we both represent. Charles R." He read it 3 times. Then he tore it in half. To him, it wasn't a letter from a king. It was a betrayal from a brother. Sarah found the pieces later, scattered on the floor near the fireplace. She didn't pick them up. She just whispered, "It's over." But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because that very evening, an anonymous courier arrived at the gates carrying a manila envelope addressed to the Duke of York. The guards, assuming it was more legal correspondence, handed it over without inspection. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Candid images, time-stamped, showing Andrew meeting with certain donors in private clubs across Europe. Some of the faces were familiar: businessmen, diplomats, individuals already under scrutiny in the ongoing investigation. And at the bottom of the stack, one image stood out. It showed Andrew standing beside a high-ranking government official at a charity event. Behind them, a banner for Sarah's trust. In his hand, a glass of champagne, paid for, according to documents later leaked, by the charity's funds. Someone was building a case. Someone wanted him cornered. Andrew realized it immediately. Sarah accused him of leaking stories to deflect blame. "You think if they crucify me, they'll forgive you?" she shouted. Andrew shot back. "You were the one with the charity, not me. You spent the money. You lied to the press." The shouting could be heard from outside. Even the guards flinched. Then, one night, Sarah disappeared. No announcement, no goodbye, just gone. Later, tabloids reported she had left the country for personal reasons. But insiders claimed it was more dramatic, that she had been escorted out quietly under royal instruction. Andrew was alone. Royal Lodge, once filled with laughter, now echoed with emptiness. The clocks ticked louder. The rooms felt colder. The silence stretched on. He was isolated, monitored, and under investigation. Every phone call was recorded. Every movement logged. Even the staff began avoiding him, sensing that the man who once held royal authority now held only suspicion. He had gone from duke to detainee. In one of his darker moments, he phoned an old confidant, his voice low and shaky. "They've taken everything. My home, my name, my family. What's next, my life?" The voice on the other end replied, "They don't need to take your life, Andrew. They've already taken your future." That night, as rain lashed against the windows, Andrew wandered through the corridors of Royal Lodge one last time. He paused before a mirror in the Grand Hall, the same mirror where he once adjusted his uniform before public ceremonies. Now, he barely recognized the man staring back. A fallen prince, a disgraced soldier, a ghost clinging to walls that no longer belonged to him. When he turned away, he whispered something to himself, so faintly the guards outside couldn't hear it. "I won't go quietly." The next morning, the king received word that Andrew had refused to vacate the estate. The Crown estate prepared for legal action. Police were notified. The eviction, initially intended to be discreet, was now about to become public and ugly. And just when the monarchy thought it had reached the peak of scandal, something unexpected happened. Someone leaked the photographs, the same ones that had been delivered anonymously to Royal Lodge. They appeared across front pages worldwide. And suddenly, the question wasn't just whether Andrew had misused funds. It was whether someone inside Buckingham Palace had helped cover it up. Royal Lodge was no longer just a home. It was now the crime scene of a royal cover-up. And what investigators would find hidden within its walls would stun even the king himself. For centuries, Buckingham Palace has been more than a symbol of royalty. It's been a vault of secrets. Every scandal, every family betrayal, every royal misstep has been carefully recorded, cataloged, and buried deep within its walls. The palace doesn't destroy history, it hides it. And somewhere inside those walls, in a restricted wing few ever enter, sat a set of files that could unravel the monarchy from within. Files tied directly to Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson, and an internal cover-up that stretched back years before anyone knew. They were labeled simply, "Private Correspondence, Duke of York." To the untrained eye, they looked like standard administrative archives, routine memos, scheduling notes, letters between departments. But to those who knew what they were looking at, these files were dynamite. Because they didn't just contain correspondence, they contained proof. Proof that the palace had known about Andrew and Sarah's financial irregularities long before the public ever did. It began when a junior archivist stumbled across an entry in an old ledger while cross-referencing royal travel expenditures. The ledger listed a series of unofficial overseas engagements linked to Andrew between 2016 and 2019. The funding source? Charitable partnerships. That term caught her attention. It was the same phrase now being scrutinized in Sarah's charity investigation. Curious, she followed the trail, and what she found made her freeze. Attached to those entries were internal memos, each bearing the Buckingham Palace letterhead, stamped confidential, and marked for review by Office of the Private Secretary. One of the memos even included Sarah Ferguson's signature, acknowledging receipt of funds for charitable coordination. The archivist, unsure of what to do, flagged the material to her supervisor. Within 24 hours, that entire archive section was locked down. And within 48 hours, the king was briefed. The report was delivered discreetly in a plain leather folder. Charles opened it slowly, his face unreadable as he read the summaries. Each page brought a new revelation, a chain of emails, internal authorizations, and handwritten notes suggesting that members of the royal household might have approved or overlooked questionable transactions tied to Andrew's engagements. At one point, Charles closed the folder and stared at the floor. "So it wasn't just them," he said quietly. "We failed too." His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, hesitated. "Your Majesty, it's not clear who knew what or when." "But someone did," Charles said sharply. "Someone allowed this to happen." That was the moment he decided to dig deeper, not just into Andrew's affairs, but into the entire system that had protected him for years. And that's when he discovered the existence of the York dossiers. For decades, the palace had maintained what insiders jokingly called the insurance cabinet, a collection of classified files on every senior royal, documenting controversies, internal complaints, and legal risks. It was never meant for public view. It was a precaution, a way for the institution to protect itself.